Hello and welcome to the Byline podcast from the Byline Times. It's what the papers don't say, what radio doesn't report, and what telly doesn't tell you. My name is Adrian Goldberg. This time, Europe shift to the far right. In EU elections, voters in France, Germany and Italy have all shown an increasing appetite for populist anti-immigrant parties. The French president, Emmanuelle Macron, has reacted by calling a snap parliamentary election after his party was beaten into second place in the EU poll by Marine Le Pen's National Rally. In Germany, the Social Democrats, the party of Chancellor Olaf Scholz, were pushed into third place by the nationalist AfD. The most successful German party were the Christian Democrats, but their success was partly dependent on taking a tougher line on migration and measures to combat climate change. Overall, the Greens lost support. The result still leaves the EU Parliament dominated by traditional centre-right and centre-left parties. But for how long will that remain the case? And what do these results tell us more broadly about the appeal of the far right in Europe? Well, we're joined on the Byline podcast by Seema Saida. Seema is based in Marseille. She's a researcher working on European politics for the UK-based campaign group Another Europe is Possible. And Linda Kalcher. Linda is based in Belgium. She's the executive director of a pan-European think tank called Strategic Perspectives. Welcome both. Firstly, let's just get an upsum of where you think we are. Seema, what do these results tell us about the state of European politics? Because from my UK vantage point, it all looks rather worrying at the moment.
Well, no one can really say that the rise of the far right wasn't something that was predicted beforehand. The polls were showing it, and the far right has been incrementally rising over the past few years. What we've really seen that is quite shocking is the complete collapse of the Liberal centre, as well as also the Greens. And I think what this is showing is that the appetite for people for continuity politics has completely gone now. And as we've seen the rise of the cost of living crisis, the rise of inflation, people are looking for radical alternatives. And as long as these radical alternatives are being provided by the right, people are ready to move further and further towards the extremes.
I would take a more nuanced stance here. I think in the countries you mentioned, obviously, we have seen these far-right parties coming out strong, but overall, the center parties have held quite a strong composition in the parliament. And if you look underneath the surface, for example, the Green family as a collective in Germany got more seats than the hard right. Also in Italy, you can see how the center-left actually in total has gained seats, whereas the center-right, including Meloni, has overall reduced some of the seats. So I think it's a relatively mixed bag across the continent, but I fully agree with what Seema said, that the cost of living crisis and the concerns of migration have been a very, very big driver for the votes.
In the UK, we tend to see this as something of a problem of the Anglosphere. You've obviously had Donald Trump in the United States. You've had politicians like Boris Johnson and Liz Truss, Home Secretaries like Suella Braverman and Priti Patel pushing a very strong anti-migrant narrative. And I think from our perspective, it's surprising to see this perhaps happening in mainstream Europe, albeit that it was, as you say, predicted to some extent in these EU elections. But we have very different politics here than I would say on mainland Europe, which is generally a kind of centrist, social democrat kind of setup. So what's changed?
I would say that events in the Anglosphere aren't completely isolated from what's going on in Europe. I would say, especially with the move towards the far right and the extreme right, there are increasing transnational links and increasing coordinated efforts for extreme right ideologies, and I'll use the word fascist ideologies, to be promulgated around the globe. And we're seeing it outside of Europe as well. For instance, what's going on in India. And it's quite interesting, for instance, if you look at the Indian case, someone like Katie Hopkins, who's quite extreme right wing right-wing British commentariat now goes to India and talks on YouTube channels reaching millions of people. So I think this is also happening in Europe as well. For instance, Katie Hopkins, Tommy Robinson, far-right figures have done tours in Europe, have joined up with Viktor Orban. Nigel Farage as well is good friends with the far-right across Europe. So there is this concerted effort. And I would say that there are structural economic factors as well that affect both the Anglosphere and the European sphere. Again, the cost of living crisis, again, rising inequality, the need to tackle the climate crisis, but the lack of effort putting into joining trade unions and the popular working classes into that movement and reassuring people that jobs will remain. All of these issues are rising. And it's easy to use migration as a scapegoat in these situations, especially where these often liberal governing parties are actually allowing increased migration because it's important to the economy. Now, I would argue that migration is a human right and we should not value human beings and commodify them in that way. But it is a fact that actually in Europe, we have an aging population and migration is necessary. So the increased migration is not being supported by investment in public services. It's not being supported by good social policies and social justice. Instead, people are being individualized and atomized while energy companies make huge profits and inflation rises, and there isn't that support for the population. And this is what is pushing people, in my view, further towards the far right. And I agree with what Linda's saying as well, that the social democratic parties and also the left parties, they haven't had the collapse that was predicted as well. The left in the European Parliament stayed relatively stable. So it shows that there's still appetite for those ideas as well.
And on Byline in the past, we've explored some of the funding for far-right ideology, for far-right groups, some of it coming from the United States, some of it from Russia. How significant a factor do you think that is?
The question of funding is really crucial, and I think I'd be very interested to see more deeper investigations into where the funding for the European far right is coming from. But I think it's also helping the far right to have the resources to organize locally and in communities. And one of the things that I've heard in Germany, especially, for instance, is that the far right is organizing locally and asking people what are their local concerns. And some of these local concerns are small things like changes to insulation policy that the Greens might have implemented that are hitting property owners more. And it's small things like this that the far right are latching onto and using as a way to increase their power as well. And having the finance and the resources to mobilize on the ground is something that is helping them, in my view.
Linda, within the European Parliament, the EPP, which is the party of Ursula von der Leyen, remains the single largest party. But my understanding is that Ursula von der Leyen is not guaranteed a second term as president, that she may have to look to support from Giorgia Meloni in Italy, for example, which would not go down well with some of the people who might otherwise support von der Leyen. So what happens if Ursula von der Leyen is not re-elected as president? Does that mean that the EPP ceases to be the dominant force, that this kind of centre-right, relatively moderate grouping loses some of its power?
Yeah, we're going to see an interesting balancing act and sort of negotiations on multiple levels. So in terms of actual timeline, the first thing that needs to happen is that indeed the EPP has to take forward who they want to push. But factually speaking, it will be German Chancellor Scholz that will propose von der Leyen as president, as she's the German national. And then she needs to get approved by all the European heads of states, 27 of them. And that will happen at the end of the month as part of a bigger package on the top jobs. So that includes who gets the European Parliament, who gets the European Council. And also it might still be that the NATO job is in that mix. And there we will need to see a balance between political parties as well as a balance between geographies, because you want to avoid that it's just the North or just the South or just the East getting the most powerful positions. So that will be a bit of a balancing act. And I think this sort of multi-level negotiations and coalitions and compromises might actually be an area which is different from the US, because there you're very much in a bipartisan system and you don't need to go deeper into compromises and negotiations as frequently on so many levels as we have in the EU. If it wasn't to be Ursula von der Leyen, I would still expect that the EPP, and specifically the German EPP, will want to have a strong mark on the future top jobs. But indeed, in a first instance, she might actually need Meloni's support in the European Council. But that needs to be, as you rightly pointed out, balanced out by other political leaders. And if you look at who the ECR group in the European Parliament includes the Law and Justice group from Poland. And obviously, the current Polish Prime Minister, Tusk, who is from the EPP, doesn't want to see aligned nationally with his biggest opponents. So it's not a natural match that the EPP and the ECR will go together. Equally, on the EPP side, they clearly said, oh, we don't want to have a coalition with the AfD in Germany. We don't want to see being aligned with Le Pen in France. And I think that brings us almost to the French elections, because also now that Macron called for a national parliamentary elections at the end of the month, it can't be that his Renew group in the European Parliament is seen aligned with the far right, because that would be perceived as aligning with Le Pen at the European level. So that would show inconsistency. So there is really at the national level a lot of conflicts that make this wonderful marriage between the EPP and the ECR a marriage that will not happen.
Is it possible that one of the emerging far-right parties in the EU might somehow assume the presidency as a result of this haggling process?
No, I can see that they might want to have a strong position. I could see how, if you look at their asks, it could be that they are eyeing for a position that has a say on migration. There have been talks about a defense commissioner or a stronger portfolio that links to security. These could traditionally be portfolios that could be given to such a party. But remember that every commissioner also needs to be vetted in the European Parliament. So there again, we've seen in the past that even commissioners from big countries such as France were just opposed by the European Parliament because they said they're not fit for purpose, they're not representing our values or our priorities. So that will be a long and interesting journey until hopefully only the end of the year to sort out all these positions.
Seema, I think I'm paraphrasing you. I may have your quote exact when you said that you thought that migration was a human right. You'll be aware, I know, as somebody who was born in the UK, that migration was one of the big underlying issues in the EU referendum, one of the primary causes, I would argue, of Brexit. And that's also behind the rise of many of these far-right parties in the European Union. So does the EU have to start thinking about freedom of movement within its own borders? Does it have to start acknowledging the concerns, perhaps more rigorously than it has done so far, about the numbers of people arriving from outside the European Union to live within it?
What I would say is that if you dig deeper into the figures, for instance, of the Brexit vote and the constituencies that voted leave, there's a deeper story of public disinvestment, of abandonment by governments, of people left behind, of rising inequality, of unemployment. And migration has always been used as a scapegoat for these issues. And what the European Union needs to do, and what the centrist parties that have kind of held the bargaining power in the European Union, what they've historically done is they've allowed migration to continue to be used as a scapegoat for these failures in investment, for the rising inequality that people are experiencing. And you can see this as well on the national level. For instance, if you look at France, Macron has never had in this recent legislative round an absolute majority, and he's passed through extremely unpopular policies like pension reforms and reforms to education services using presidential powers and without a majority in the Legislative Assembly. And what he's also passed through migration laws with the support of the extreme right and without the support of his own party as well recently. And what he's been doing is playing into this whole rhetoric that migration is to blame with one hand, whilst with the other hand taking away the basic social democratic rights that workers in France fought for in a hard-won way, and which there was no democratic support for those moves. So what Europe really needs to do is stand boldly and change its economic policies in order to address the economic needs of the population so that they are not pushed towards the far right. And they need to stand strongly as well in favor of migration and tell the truth to the people that it's not migration that's causing this economic crisis.
I really want to echo Seema's point that austerity policies are a big concern. And we've seen a lot of studies that showed how austerity measures just increase dissatisfaction with some of the political leadership. And I think, especially if you look at some of the results of the German AfD, it was often working class people that really felt, oh, there's nothing in it for me. And then you immediately come back to the points that Seema made earlier on the local infrastructure or the sort of support that on the rhetoric level seems to be going to migrants or anybody else but their core concerns. So it's really on that level that Europe needs to improve, with the caveat, though, that that's not necessarily what the EPP strives to do. And that's also not necessarily what some of the hard right governments or parties in government have actually delivered for their countries. If you look at some of the Nordic countries, there you almost see a shift back to the center left, probably also out of the dissatisfaction that some of the governments didn't actually deliver. So it's often at the rhetoric, but then it's also not yet you can necessarily trust the hard right to follow through. And I think that will be an interesting dynamic to watch in France. Some considered it a gamble that Macron called these elections. I'm the wrong person to judge, but it's really going to be interesting how the Europeans can make the transition more affordable, more inclusive, ensure that also some of the green manufacturing jobs are done here and not in China or the US, and that the investments really happen into the European economy. But that's not necessarily something that the center right or the frugal countries in the north of Europe are actually favoring. So it will be an interesting debate.
And there have been protests, haven't there, from farmers within the European Union complaining that new environmental regulations will make life very difficult for them. There's been some backtracking from the European Union on that. There's been concerns about the degree to which combating climate change can force changes in behaviour. And I wonder whether that's led to the decline of the Greens in these EU elections. Again, these are issues, aren't they, that are often picked upon by the far right to enhance support, to say that either we don't need to combat climate change or that we can't combat climate change, and therefore we don't need to make the difficult compromises that sometimes go along with that.
To be honest, it's a very difficult conversation to unpack. And unfortunately, it is indeed the parties on the hard right that can easily say, oh, it's eco-dictatorship, or somebody forces you to buy an electric car, somebody forces you to buy a heat pump, even though it's currently more expensive. So the fact that some of the social support and affordability measures haven't been taken along is a fact that played into it. However, if you look at how many people are currently suffering because of flooding, because of the heat waves, it is the farmers, it is the same people with low income households that can actually not afford to insulate their houses, that cannot afford an air conditioning. They are less likely to have the insurance to actually cover their household loss now that you saw the flooding in the south of Germany. It's a dynamic to watch because it's also not the far right that catered for them that have been affected. And if you look at the farmers in Spain and south of Italy, they already have to rationalize their water. So it's pressing topics from all sides that have come to them, not just the environmental policies, because ultimately they could even, in the midterm, help the farmers and make their food production more resilient. But it's often in the midterm that the benefits are coming, and the sort of right out being upset that on top of your high energy bill, on top of your household bill, somebody seems to force you to buy a heat pump, that's bringing some dissatisfaction for sure.
Just to add that the Greens and the traditional left parties probably need to do more work to reach out to the farming and agricultural constituencies, I would say, because we don't often see them as the natural supporters of green or left policies. And I think that banking on young and urban votes is not enough for these parties to push forward their climate agenda as well. And so I think it's just an area where more work needs to be done. And I agree with what Linda's saying. Of course, climate change is affecting all of these constituencies, and the answers aren't going to come from the climate deniers. So it's an imperative, really, that this work is done.
There's a consensus between you, I think, that mainstream politicians haven't sold the benefits of migration well enough, that they haven't sold the benefits of mitigating climate change enough. Is the reality that people just aren't ready for the scale of migration that the EU currently accommodates, or that people aren't ready to accept the environmental mitigations of mainstream politicians?
I would say that the ideological roots of the anti-migration sentiment that we have in Europe are actually very, very deep. And so too are the ideological roots of the far-right parties. For instance, if we look at the French context, France has a long history of colonialism, which actually still continues today, if you've been watching what's been happening in New Caledonia, in Kanaki. And this tradition and this history is something that's erased and not really addressed and talked about. And there's a lot of theory, including from Aimé Césaire, that talks about how that experience of brutalizing and creating a hierarchy of races around the world and the philosophy of a civilizing mission, which justified colonialism, boomeranged back to Europe in the fascist period, where that brutalization was turned against European Jewish populations and against political opponents. And that legacy of fascism, I think, in France especially, has not actually been dealt with. For instance, figures like Coco Chanel and Le Corbusier are popular cultural figures whose collaboration with fascism has never really been addressed, and they've been rehabilitated. And that history really needs to be understood, because Marine Le Pen is the inheritor of a literal fascist party. Reconquête, Eric Zemmour's party, is to the right of her. So we need to acknowledge these deep ideological roots. We need to talk about those. And that's the link also to the anti-migration discourse we have today. And until we discuss these systemic and deeper issues, I think it's going to be difficult to really break the ideological hold that a lot of the racism that motivates the anti-migration sentiment in Europe is driven by.
Linda, how endangered is the European project itself? Again, a feature of hard right or far right parties is a Euroscepticism. It doesn't necessarily go as far as the Euroscepticism of the UK, leading ultimately to Brexit. And these far right parties may not all agree amongst themselves over a range of topics. But nevertheless, again, there is a tide, isn't there, within the European right of anti-EU sentiments.
Yes, and it's been actually toned down quite a lot, probably also in the wake of Brexit. So the Dutch or the French and the Italians don't actually call for their specific exits anymore, but it's more palatable almost. It's less extreme. It's more that they want to reform the European Union from within, but it all boils down to we want more sovereignty at home, which to the voters is probably very appealing. Factually, it hasn't played out in the last years. If you look at every country in the European Union trying to first be at the global market to get the vaccines for themselves, ultimately they figure out, oh, we're increasing prices for each other. Let's do it jointly. In the wake of the Russian war on Ukraine, everybody went out to secure the best and fastest available gas to diversify away from Putin. What did it lead to? Increased prices for everyone. And everybody went back to, maybe we should do it jointly. So if you look at the competition from the US or China, everybody say, let's protect my own companies. Let's protect my industry. I'm going to invest every cent I have in my own production. And then they figure out, maybe on aggregate, we're not actually getting the technologies or jobs or economic resilience we need. Maybe we need to do it jointly. And I think that's a bit of almost a tradition over the last 5 years that they figure out that maybe eventually some of these things are better done jointly. And there, to look at Meloni again, she at least says in terms of security and defense, the NATO stance, and we better do it jointly, which is not exactly what Le Pen and others are saying. So there's where underneath the surface, some of the hard right can't actually agree. And that is why they will not reemerge as a supergroup or be able to align with the conservatives on everything.
Just one point on language, Linda, that you've used the phrase hard right, as have I, and I noticed that phrase creeping into a BBC News report today. We've traditionally talked about the far right for parties that seem to make an obsession of migration and who are very skeptical of climate change and so on. Is that also what we mean by the hard right, or is there a difference between the two?
I would tend to say I adapt to the native speaker. But it's true that even when I discuss it with some of my colleagues across Europe, they use hard right, far right, extreme right, and then others use populist because there are some groups that are more populist, which means probably more Eurosceptic, but not economically as hard right. But I think it's a bit blurry on that term. Where I'm getting concerned is when indeed some of the parties that are far right or hard right now want to brand themselves as traditionally conservative. And I think there it's getting a bit worrying, especially back to Seema's initial points, because on racism or fascism, there's still clear lines between them. And that's when we look at how the negotiations will unfold in the parliament. That's where the EPP at least said clearly, we will draw a line on the rule of law, we will draw a line on democracy and supporting the European Union, as well as support for Ukraine.
I just wonder, Sima, whether using this term hard right, ironically, actually softens what we're talking about when we are talking about far right parties, parties who border on what we used to call fascism.
Exactly, yes. And this is really where the danger is really, really evident now, because I feel like we've been using these terms for a long time, since 2016 when Trump was elected. And actually, what we've seen with Trump supporters is very anti-democratic and dangerous tendencies. For instance, the March on Washington invading the Capitol Hill, in Charlottesville, when we saw Trump supporters parading and chanting "Jews will not replace us," which are all really, really shocking. And even in Italy, where we've seen images of people doing Mussolini salutes in the streets. So I think there really is a red line that has to be drawn. I think if you look at history and the rise of fascism, many of these parties at first attained power by using democratic means, by using electoral means. And that's how they first appeared on the scene. And then it became a point, once they monopolized democratic institutions, they were able to then turn off democracy, so to speak. And I feel like this is where the danger lies, because the democratic institutions are being canalized by far-right parties, but also because centre-right parties are moving to the far right themselves, as we've seen with what Macron's doing, passing laws with the support of the far right. This boundary is becoming increasingly blurred, and I think there really is a danger here, and it needs to be drawn. And I really hope the European People's Party, the EPP, isn't going to cross the line, because that's the last bastion that we really have at this stage. So let's have our fingers crossed for what happens next.
Yeah, and that's certainly something that we've seen here in the UK, where I think most neutral observers would acknowledge that the Labour Party has moved towards the right in terms of its language on migration, for example, reacting to the Conservative Party being dragged to the right by the rise of Reform and Nigel Farage in this country as well. I don't want to get this out of kilter, and you've made a very important point, Linda, that these far-right parties are not the dominant group in the European Union. They probably represent about 1 in 5 of the seats in the European Parliament. But one person I think who will be taking satisfaction from all of this dissent, from the rise in far-right sentiment in the UK, will be Putin and the division that the far-right sows within mainstream politics within Europe.
Yeah, I would agree. And especially in the German case was tough on a personal level, to be honest. We've seen the AfD being in scandals of catering Putin, as well as China of catering more inappropriate comparison to the SS Nazi times. And it really hurt at a personal level to see that. And then seeing them coming with such good results out of the elections yesterday. Some speak to the fact that that was largely a win on social media. And obviously, that's an area where especially some of the bots or the disinformation happens quite strongly. Some speak to the fact that for youth, it was actually the concern about migration, the concern that they have been not taken care of enough during the pandemic, and that they really sort of feel that they're discontent with the current political establishment. There's probably not just one good answer to these dynamics, but the concern is that the misaligned Europe could bring good to the forces that want to destroy it. And that's a concern that, again, in the midterm could affect those that now feel the hard right give answers to them?
I think now we also need to see reaction, unity, and joining together of the more progressive parties, of the Greens, of the Socialists, the Democrats, in order to hold that red line. And at the same time, we need parties to loudly proclaim alternative economies and alternative strategies, and to meaningfully engage with the constituencies the far right has engaged with, to reassure that we can build a progressive Europe where we tackle climate change, where we can have migration, and where people's basic needs are going to be met and there's more security. So I think that all is not lost and there's much that we can build for and work for.
Thank you both for your time. That's Seema Saida, based in Marseille, works for the campaign group Another Europe is Possible. Thanks also to Linda Kalcher, who is based in Belgium, Executive Director of Strategic Perspectives, a pan-European think tank. I'm Adrian Goldberg. This has been a We Bring audio production for Byline Audio in Birmingham with me and Harvey White. Just before we go, to remind you that we do now have a range of fantastic new audio offerings from Byline. We've got Utter Bollocks with Otto English and John Mitchinson debunking some of the most popular myths out there. We've also got Byline Times Live. We've got a fantastic offering with Hardeep Matharu and Bonnie Greer. So do check out as well, bylineaudio.com. That's bylineaudio.com. But for now, thanks for listening. We'll see you again very soon. Cheers now. Bye-bye.
Byline Audio.